the expert on the far right in Latin America will be with us sharing his new research, a comparative analysis on the recent development of the far right in Latin America. Cristóbal is a professor just moved from the Diego Portales University to the Pontificia Católica University of Chile in Santiago. Has been here for a couple of weeks and will still be here for some 10 days more, and you are all welcome to contact him. Cristóbal got his PhD at the Humboldt University in Berlin and then worked in and was visiting in several places, among which where we met at the Wissenschaftszentrum some time ago. Is the author and editor of several volumes on the issues of especially the far right. Together with Kasmud, he wrote Populism, a very short introduction for Oxford University Press. And he wrote in German for Campus a book on the far right in Kampf den Eliten in 1810-1982. And is the editor of several books, among which the Riding the Populist Wave with Cambridge University Press and the Oxford Handbook on Populism. I think this research they are doing is extremely relevant also in terms of comparing with what is happening in Europe, and I'm very glad that he's going to present his work now. So please, Cristóbal.
Yes. Many thanks, Donatella, for the presentation and also for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me being here at the Scuola Normale Superiore as a visiting fellow. My thanks also to Manuela, Caiani, and Cesar Guzman, who will comment what I'm going to present today, and also my special thanks to them because I sent the papers on Monday very late, so they only had 24 hours to prepare the comments, but this is because I was finishing some of the stuff that I'm writing. So what I'm going to tell you today, it's about the far right in Latin America in comparative perspective. This is an ongoing research project, and the main ideas I'm going to present today are based on an edited volume that I'm producing with a couple of colleagues that we hope to submit very soon, which is exactly on this topic. So in this sense, I think what it's important to mention is that whenever you think that I'm smart, it's because I'm collaborating with a lot of different peoples, mainly because of a grant that I got from Open Society Foundation, which allows us to study the far right in Latin America in comparative perspective. And in fact, what I'm going to present you today is a summary of one workshop that we had in Santiago de Chile a couple of months ago, in which we discussed different case studies of the far right in Latin America. And my main idea today is to present you a bit the introduction of the book and the conclusion, which is to a certain extent the theories behind that, but also some of the empirical findings. And many of the empirical findings, again, are related to different case studies written by very smart and wonderful colleagues. Having said that, the roadmap for today is the following. So in the next 40 minutes, I hope to talk about the following 5 points. I will start with the issue of concepts. And I think this is important because if we want to understand the far right in Latin America in comparative perspective, we need a concept that travels within Latin America, but also travels from Latin America to other places. So and I will start with this issue of how we can conceptualize the far right in a way that travels between different regions. The second aspect that I want to talk, it's about the different case studies. And in this book and in this project, we have 8 different case studies. And then I will tell you a bit about the case selection, why we decided to consider one of these cases or not, and also give you an overview about which are the main findings of each of these case studies. The third point, it's probably the $1 million question. So why is it that the far right is gaining traction in Latin America today? If you come from Europe, you're probably familiar with far right politicians. In France, for example, the Front National already started in the 70s and in the 80s. But if you look at Latin America, the far right, it's very new. Bolsonaro was probably the first example that started to get famous, but probably you have heard about Javier Milei, the picture that I had at the beginning. And I don't know about you, but personally, 1 year ago, I didn't know who was Javier Milei. And he's nowadays the president of Argentina. And this shows you that the way in which the far right is getting strong in Latin America, it's very fast. And this is, I think, one of the peculiarities also of the Latin American context, that it's different than the European one. The fourth point, I want to develop some comparisons within Latin America to try to understand which are the similarities and differences between these different far-right actors, and also try to stretch it a bit and talk about similarities and differences between the far-right in a comparative perspective, mainly with the European context. And finally, if I'm good on time, I will close with some very short remarks about the overall project and the ideas behind that. So let's start then with the first point, and this is about conceptualization. If we want to understand the far right, I think that the starting point needs to be the distinction between left and right politics. If you are familiar with the literature on this topic, I'm going to tell you something that it's relatively obvious, and this is based on the classic work of Norberto Bobbio, who says that at a very abstract level, if you want to make the distinction between left and right politics, this is about the issue of whether you consider that inequalities are natural or not. If you consider that inequalities are natural and outside of the purview of the state, probably you're moving to the right. If by contrast you think that inequalities are socially constructed and we need to do something against them, you're probably moving to the left-wing camp. Something that is very important that I will emphasize during my talk today is that when we are talking about inequalities, these are not only socioeconomic. We in comparative politics have tended to think that the issue of the left-right, it's mainly about socioeconomic inequalities. Either you're in favor of the free market or state intervention. But inequalities are also sociocultural. And in fact, when we are thinking about the far right, the sociocultural dimension is getting much more relevant than the socioeconomic one. And this is something that I will emphasize during my talk. Once we are talking about the right, at the same time, you can distinguish two different blocks, and this is mainstream right actors and far right actors. And the way in which we do this distinction, it's mainly based on two criteria. The first one is how strong is the emphasis that you put at the moment of defining these right-wing ideas, and you can do it in a very radical way, or rather in a moderate way. But there is a second aspect that it's even more relevant, and this is the relationship with democracy. A mainstream right party or a mainstream right actor will be fine with the democratic rules of the game, which means that if you don't have majority in Congress, for example, you cannot pass laws, or you have to build coalitions. If you lose the elections, you are going to give power to the other one. The far right, by contrast, defends very radical right-wing ideas, but more importantly, remember, it maintains a very difficult relationship with democracy. To use the concept of Juan Linz, it maintains either a semi-loyal or a completely disloyal relationship with the democratic system. Third and finally, within the far right, specifically in the European context, scholars normally do a distinction between two camps, and this is the extreme right and the populist radical right. Put very simple, the extreme right is deeply authoritarian. It's against the democratic system. These are actors that are going to tell you, if I win the election, I'm going to destroy democracy. Golden Dawn in Greece, a fascist party would be an example of that. Nevertheless, today, extreme right parties are not doing particularly well. The parties that are winning much more votes are populist radical right parties, which present themselves as democratic, but they maintain a very difficult relationship with the liberal component of democracy. Having said that, one important aspect of our research project is try to ask ourselves to what extent that sort of terminology travels well to the Latin American standard. And one of our first hypotheses is that doing the distinction between the extreme right and the populist radical right, it's much more complex in the Latin American context than in the European context. And this is why we prefer to use a more abstract level, and this is the far right, in which you can find these two components, the populist radical right and the extreme right. Just to give you an example, if you think about Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, there is one day in which he looks pretty like a populist radical right leader, that he's attacking just the liberal component, but other days, Jair Bolsonaro sounds pretty authoritarian. Think about what happens when he lost the election and he mobilized the people and also the military to try to disrespect the rules of the game, which is deeply authoritarian. And in fact, the case study that we include in our book, which is on Bolsonaro, Lucio Renault from the University of Brasilia, he argues, in fact, that particularly because he moves between these two camps, it's much better to talk about the far right for the case of Bolsonaro. And this is why, in general, I prefer to talk about the far right rather than the populist radical right. So to finalize the first aspect, and this is about the conceptualization, I think that the far right should be thought then as a very specific political project that it's characterized not only by defending very strong right-wing positions, but also by maintaining a very difficult relationship with the democratic system. Also, and here one work that I always like to quote, but I think to quote because I think it's pretty interesting, I think in Europe, but also in the Latin American setting, is by Lenka Bustikova, who has been working on the far right in Eastern Europe. And the reason why I found this work so interesting, because in Eastern Europe, in fact, we know that migration, it's not a main problem because there are not so many people coming to the Eastern European context in contrast to the Western European context. So the question that Lenka Bustikova asked herself is, why is it that the far right is gaining traction in Eastern Europe, although we don't have like massive influx of migrants? And I think that her work is particularly interesting because she shows that, in fact, the far right at an abstract level is not necessarily about opposing immigration, but at a more abstract level, it's about opposing the incorporation of historically marginalized groups. And who are the historically marginalized groups varies across context. In the Eastern European context, this is mainly the Gypsy community and women. And this is why the far right normally in the Eastern European context politicizes that sort of dimension. In the Latin American context, as I will come later on, and I will argue, those historically marginalized groups who have been gaining power in the last decades are mainly women and the gay community. And it's precisely because of that why this is the main target of the far right. Finally, I think that Lenka Bustikova makes an argument that travels extremely well to the Latin American context. And she says that the possibility that the far right is able to win traction, it's related to two different factors. The first one is when you have state institutions that are adapting and are developing policies to generate a better incorporation. That's the first factor. But if on the top of that, you have progressive political actors, think, for example, about left-wing political parties or civil society that are pushing for a better incorporation, then you have the ideal constellation. Because these issues are going to get more saliency, and then there is a possibility of a backlash that is going to be articulated for the far right. And much of the story that I'm going to tell you today about Latin America is exactly about that. In those countries in which you have seen state institutions better incorporating historically marginalized groups, and which at the same time you have like left-wing actors politicizing that issue, then you have the ideal setting for the rise of far-right politicians. Let's move now then to Latin America. So, and now I'm going to tell you a bit the different case studies that we have in this project. We already know that since the third wave of democracy, when democracy reappeared in Latin America at the beginning of the 1990s, right-wing parties in general were not doing particularly well. And in fact, during the 2000s, we did have the so-called pink tide, an arrival of very different kind of left-wing governments across the region. But this is changing. And in fact, I should change what it says here because I say this is slowly changing. I think this is very rapidly changing. Remember what I mentioned about Milei? I didn't know who was Milei a couple of months ago, and now he's the president of the country. So to try to map this diversity of far-right actors within the Latin American context, we work with a case selection in which we look at the level of electoral strength that the different parties and actors have. And technically speaking, we think about three scenarios. Cases in which the far right is extremely powerful when they're able to conquer government by themselves. Cases in which the far right is in an intermediate position in which they're able to build a party and might have like representative in Congress, but they're not in government. And finally, we want to include also negative case studies, places within Latin America where apparently the far right is not gaining traction so far. So based on that, we included the following case studies. These are 8 case studies that we have in our book. The first one, very obvious, is Jair Bolsonaro, who became president of Brazil in 2019. He lost the election in 2023, but if you have been following that sort of development, he lost the elections by a bit more than 1%. So he was very close about being re-elected. Nayib Bukele in El Salvador became elected in 2019, and he was just re-elected by more than 70% of the population. We have done a survey, in fact, in El Salvador just before the election, and our results were exactly like that. So I don't think that the process had been rigid. I think he has like a huge majority within the Salvadorian people. And Javier Milei, who had been talking before, he became president of Argentina in 2022. To be completely honest, when we have done the version in August last year, our case selection included Argentina as something in the middle, and now we have moved that to someone in power because of the shifts in Latin American politics. About the far right in opposition, we include 3 case studies here. One is my own country, and this is Chile, in which we have one politician whose name is José Antonio Caz, and he has built a new political party called the Partido Republicano. Funnily enough, similar name to the Republican Party in the United States, and with a very similar ideological platform. Rafael López Aliaga from Renovación Popular in Lima, in Peru, who is the mayor of Lima. And this is also an interesting case study because it's in opposition, but to a certain extent it's in government, at least at the local level. And finally, we have the case of Uruguay with Guido Ríos Manini, who comes from the military, and then he started to build his own political party, which is called Cabildo Abierto. And finally, we include 2 negative case studies within our research project, and these are Mexico and Colombia. Interestingly enough, in these 2 cases, we find certain commonalities about why apparently the far right is not getting traction here. In the case of Mexico, what we are able to show is AMLO, who was the president of Mexico until a couple of weeks ago. I mean, he's still the president, but there were elections in Mexico, and Claudia Sheinbaum from the same party, and AMLO will be the new president. But what is interesting about AMLO is that although he presents himself as a leftist, he's very conservative on the moral dimension. And our argument is precisely because he's conservative on that dimension. If you remember about the argument of Ustikova, the political opportunity structure for the rise of the far right is not really there, because you have a leftist government that it's relatively conservative on this moral dimension, so which doesn't open up the political opportunity for this kind of backlash. In the case of Colombia, it's pretty interesting that what here happens is, until very recently, until Petro was elected president of Colombia, the right has been the dominant player in the last decades. But what the authors show in their case study is all right-wing politicians that have been in power or in opposition in Colombia don't really fit the far-right definition. But this might change nowadays precisely because for the first time in the history of the country in the last 40 to 50 years, you have a left-wing government which is very leftist in the 2 dimensions, in the socio-economic and the socio-cultural. And in fact, I will come about this a bit later. Finally, about these different case studies, what I also want to show you is the leaders behind these parties have very different organizational trajectories. And also one of the things that we want to map here is to try to cover this different diversity of kind of leaderships that we are observing across of the far right in Latin America. To try to map this diversity, the first question that we try to answer here is whether should we talk about a sort of new far right or about an old far right. Remember that the far right, the way in which we define it is because it presents very radical right-wing positions, but maintains an ambivalent and difficult relationship with democracy. And we have had far-right politicians and actors of these kinds in the past, but the difference is in the past, these kind of actors were not really willing to build something to compete in elections. In my own country, think about Augusto Pinochet. He didn't like parties. He didn't want to compete in elections. And in fact, he was a military general who made a coup d'etat. The same in Argentina, the same in Brazil, the same in several other countries of the southern corner. The novelty, I would say, is that the far right today, it's really willing to compete in the electoral arena. And in fact, they're able to win elections. This is the case of Bolsonaro. This is the case of Milei. We also know that they are very bad about losing elections. And this is what happens in Brazil with Bolsonaro. Apparently, the institutions were strong enough to resist, But there is an open question of what happens when the far right is able to establish itself for a longer period of time. This would be the case of El Salvador. My feeling is once they get entrenched, they're not going to lose power very easily. But nevertheless, they're trying to build something, build coalitions and electoral vehicles so that they can try to compete in the electoral arena. So if you look at all the cases that are part of this new far right, then we can identify different kinds of electoral vehicles. Probably the most common one is the formation of new political parties, and I say political parties like this because these are very personalist electoral vehicles. If you try to understand La Libertad Avanza in Argentina, which is the party of Milei, you just need to understand Milei because he controls the party. So there is a party organization, but the party organization is completely dependent on the leader. Something that is very different normally from the European context. Probably in the European context, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands would be the only example that is a bit similar. I don't know if you're familiar with the case, but the party, the PVV, has 2 members. I don't know if you know that. That's Geert Wilders and one foundation that is controlled by Geert Wilders. So, but here you have like that sort of model, very personalist electoral vehicles who are dependent to a certain extent on the charismatic figure that is able to mobilize the people. And here we have the classic examples of Milei and the example of also Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. The case of Uruguay, the guy on the side there, it's a bit different. This might have to do with the tradition of political parties in Uruguay because Cabildo Abierto is trying to develop a political organization. There are going to be elections this year in Uruguay, and apparently the party is polling very, very bad. So it might be that the party is going to disappear. But at least in the case of Uruguay, you are seeing a sort of organization that's trying to move beyond the leader. But again, it's an open question whether it's going to be successful or not. There is another option of how these far-right politicians can try to organize themselves, and this is taking a party that already existed. And once they control that party, they move that party that it was not a far-right party and transform the party into a far-right organization. This is a case of Renovación Popular in Peru. This is a right-wing party that already existed, but it didn't have like clear far-right ideas. But once López Aliaga controls the party, tends to move the party into that direction. And the same with Jair Bolsonaro, who has been a long-term figure in the political system within Brazil, competing in different political organizations, but he was able to control the Liberal Party and move the Liberal Party into a far-right organization. There is a third option that we also observe in the Latin American context, and this is a split of the mainstream right. The case of Chile, it's a paradigmatic example in this sense. The guy that you see here, José Antonio Cast, who is a long-established politician who made his whole career within the UDI, which is a far-right and a mainstream right party. And in fact, he started to complain that the UDI, the mainstream right party, started to over-accommodate to progressive values. And precisely because of this argument, then he decided to build a new political party. And if you look at who are the people that are within the party, the Partido Republicano, many of them come, in fact, from the mainstream right. So in this sense, technically speaking, it's a new party, but you can also consider that because of the kind of members that it has, it's very much related to the mainstream right. Something that, by the way, we can also see in the European context. You have heard about Nigel Farage in the UK, who was a long-term politician within the UK Conservative Party. He decided to move away and to build different electoral coalitions. And in fact, there is an ongoing debate. We are going to see what happens after the elections this Sunday in Britain, that he might come back to the Conservative Party and try to move the Conservative Party and transform finally into a far-right party. But also think about Vox in Spain. Santiago Abascal was a long-term politician at the subnational level within the PP. And if you look at most of the high-ranks officials within the Vox party, most of them come also from the Partido Popular. And finally, there is another option, which is the possibility that a mainstream right party transform itself into a far-right organization, which will be the US-American model. Until before Donald Trump came to power, we assumed that the Republican Party was a mainstream right party, a very conservative one, but we still consider a mainstream right party. But nowadays, we are sure that it's not a mainstream right party anymore, but rather a populist radical right party. The woman that you see here, it's a senator from Colombia. Her last name is Cabal. And although we consider Colombia as a negative case study, one of the arguments that the author of this case study shows is that there are already some movements within the mainstream right, and there are some politicians, Cabal being one of the main figures, who is trying to transform the mainstream right party into a far-right organization. And of course, it's an open question whether she will succeed or not, but if she's able to do it, then you will see a transformation of the mainstream from within, similar to the US-American scenario. Let's move now to the third point, and this is the $1 million question. So why is it that the far right is gaining traction today and not before? And remember Milei, the example that I put you, 1 year ago, nobody knew who he is, and now he's the president of Argentina. There is one way of answering that question that it's very simple, but it's not very useful. The obvious answer to the question of why far-right politicians are getting elected is because the far-right electorate in Latin America has moved to the right. And if people start to be far-right, it's obvious that then they will vote for far-right politicians. Then you have like the people are voting for the right guy, so to say. If you look at empirical evidence, there is no reasons to think that people in Latin America are getting more conservative. In fact, if you look at different pieces of public opinion and different pieces of research, and I'm quoting here just 2 different articles recently published, you find relatively the opposite. The Latin American electorate, in the long-term perspective, it's getting a bit more liberal and not a bit more conservative, which is a sort of paradox. If the people is getting more liberal, why the hell is it that far-right politicians are getting elected? The piece, for example, by Abrumaya et al., they do a very good analysis on issues of LGBT rights in Latin America, and they show that systematically Latin American voters are getting more progressive on that dimension, and there are no signs, either if you look at country cases, aggregate cases, that the people are getting more conservative. Just to support that sort of argument, I will present you 3 very simple pieces of evidence, and after that I will try to develop another or alternative explanations for the rise of the far right across of Latin America. I will use always the so-called LAPOP database, which is a Latin American public opinion project. It's a database that collects public opinion for the whole of the Americas, from Canada till Chile, and it does surveys every 2 years approximately. Unfortunately, we only have the data till 2018 because the new wave, it's not ready yet. But I hope that it will be ready yet so that we can expand it. And consider here that I will always present the average for whole of Latin America. So I'm including from Mexico to Chile, all the countries, and I'm just presenting the medium voters, so to say. And if you look at that question, for example, which is about abortion and whether the people are in favor of abortion and a very specific condition, which is when the mother's health is in danger, you see an important increase of time of about 10 points. Again, remember, this is the whole of Latin America. If I will put, for example, out Central America, which is much more conservative than South America, the numbers are much higher. But again, I'm just being conservative, so to say, I'm aggregating the data for the whole region. If you look at another question, that this is about approval or disapproval for same-sex couples, you also see an increase over time of roughly 10 points. It's still relatively low if you want. It goes from 28% to 39%, but you see an increase of 10 points. And remember, again, I aggregated data for the whole Latin America. If I take out Central America, which is much more conservative, the line, it's much more impressive. Finally, third piece of evidence, it's how the people define themselves in the classic scale that goes from 1 being on the left to right being on number 10. And here I have the values for 2004, 2010, and 2018. And what you can see here, it's a sort of Gauss curve that most people tend to move to the center. And you don't have too many people identifying themselves either on number 10, so which be on the far right, or identifying in number 1, which be on the far left. And in fact, if you see any change, it's a bit more to the left rather than to the right. So a bit more of people are identifying themselves as leftists in number 4, but again, it's a minor movement. But again, if you look at these 3 pieces of evidence, reinforces an argument that already other scholars have done with much more sophisticated empirical data to show that there is no evidence of a backlash of the mass left. Interestingly enough, that kind of argument travels to many other contexts. If you look, for example, the book of Larry Bartels for Europe on democracy erodes from the top, he argues exactly the same for Europe. And he shows that, in fact, there is no backlash at the mass level in the European context. If you look at other pieces of evidence by other scholars comparing data from other places of the world, you will also find similar arguments that it's very difficult to find a sort of backlash argument at the mass level across different places of the world. So if this is not the case, the question is, why is it that far-right politicians are gaining traction across of Latin America? I belong to those scholars that I think it's impossible to develop a general theory that will explain the rise of the far-right in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Italy, Poland, etc. But we can try to do is to map different contextual factors that might change that can facilitate the opening up of the electoral opportunity structure. To do that, what we normally do within those who are studying comparative politics and the far right is that we try to think about the demand side and the supply side. Demand side means changes at the level of the electorate that might push the electorate to demand certain things, or think about the supply side, and this is changes within the agency, within the political actors, the political parties that might decide to appeal to far-right ideas. And we can also identify two kinds of dimensions that we normally see in the literature, and this is about the national dimension, much more related to domestic politics, and an international dimension, which is much more related to transformation at the global level that might affect the electoral opportunity structure that facilitate the rise of the far right. If you consider these two dimensions, we have something that we love in comparative politics, 2x2 tables, that can try to bring some sort of order within the disorder. And what I will do in the next minutes is to go to each of these boxes to present you some of the contextual factors that are changing within Latin America that facilitate the rise of far-right actors and politicians. If you think about the national dimension and the demand side, there are two arguments that are important to consider. The first one is that during the 2000s, most governments across of Latin America were controlled by the left. And this is a so-called pink tide or turn to the left. Many of those governments, not all of them, were involved in huge corruption scandals. And if left-wing governments are involved in corruption scandal, it's very logic that the electorate will punish them. And in fact, one of the reasons of why the far right is being successful is because left-wing governments have been involved in this sort of corruption scandal. The clearest example here is in Brazil. If you're familiar with Brazilian politics in the last few years, there was a so-called Lava Jato scandal, which I would say is almost equivalent to the Tangentopoli scandal in Italy at the beginning of the 90s. And this really hurt the PT, the mainstream left party. And one of the reasons of why Bolsonaro was so successful is because Bolsonaro was ranting against the PT, but against the whole establishment, claiming that they were pretty corrupt. And to a certain extent, they were. And again, the reason why Bolsonaro, again, was successful in this sense is not necessarily programmatic, but it's because people were fed up with the establishment. And the far right was able to claim that sort of argument. The second issue that I think it's important to consider within the Latin American context, if we have a lot of empirical evidence showing that there is one issue that the electorate across of Latin America is demanding, and this is what we call mano dura, iron fist policies against crime. If you look at public opinion data across of Latin America, this is normally the main issue that people are demanding. I would say it's the equivalent probably to immigration in the European context. And the far right, it's very good about connecting with that sort of demand because they're going to say all other politicians on the left and on the mainstream right are not really willing to do what they need to do. And this is to get rid of the rule of law to try to combat crime. And this is one of the main policies that the far right is able to develop. El Salvador and Bukele would be a prime example of that. If we go now to the international dimension and the demand side, there is one important factor to consider, and this is the end of the commodity boom. Remember again that I told you a couple of minutes ago that we had a turn to the left during the 2000s. Many of those governments were relatively successful because this was a period of time in which commodities went up, and most Latin American economies are heavily dependent on the international price of commodities. But once the price of these commodities went down, these left-wing governments were not able to deliver, just because they didn't have money to develop the kind of policies that they wanted. And once you have economic downturns, it's logic that many people will punish the incumbents. So one of the reasons why Bolsonaro is successful, why Milei is successful, is not necessarily because of the programmatic agenda of those leaders, but because the guys who have been previously in government were not able to deal with the economy in a proper manner, to a certain extent because they might have been irresponsible, but also because the end of the commodity boom. And this also opened up the electoral opportunity structure for punishing incumbents, and the far right can really profit from that. If we move now to the international dimension, but the supply side, think about agency now. So why is it that far-right parties are able to develop ideas that can win traction across a society? There is one aspect that we really need much more research into that. I think part of the problem is very difficult doing research into that, and this is about the transnational dimension. If you're a far-right party in Latin America today, you have many models that you can try to imitate. You can call to Spain to box, you can call Donald Trump, you can call different leaders across the world, and in fact, we know that there are networks of these leaders that are getting together. Vox in Spain, I have done some preliminary research into that. I think it's crucial because Vox is really trying to connect the Latin American far right with the European far right. And it's in a privileged situation because it's in Europe, but speaks the same language, so to say. And then you see the interaction. And the concept that I try to bring in is the concept of transnational advocacy networks, that I think it works very well because scholars normally assume that these transnational advocacy networks are the good ones, the ones that are promoting human rights and progressive values. But I think that the transnational advocacy networks can work also from the other side. And you might have very conservative actors that are willing to develop these kinds of organizations. And again, I think it's difficult to do research into that, but there are some preliminary findings that show that these networks are pretty active. Finally, and I close this part of the presentation with the last quadrant, and this is the supply side and the national dimension. And here, there are two arguments that might help us to explain also why these far-right politicians and ideas are gaining traction. The first one is that in many Latin American countries, and this is something that is happening not only in Latin America, also in Europe, you have a crisis of the mainstream right. When you have mainstream right parties that are not able to develop programmatic proposals that are attractive enough for right-wing voters, these voters are orphaned, and they need to vote for someone. And they will definitely not vote for the left. They might end up voting for the far right. In the case of Argentina, the figure that I put here, Macri, is crucial. He was the guy who comes from the mainstream right. He says, I'm going to solve the problem of the economy, but he was not able to do it. And then people get fed up with him because they say, okay, you promised that you are the one who are going to solve the issue. And if you look at the economic situation of Argentina and the amount of debt that the country has with the International Monetary Fund has to do with him. So he was not able to deal with the economy. Or if you think about Sebastián Piñera, the other guy in the picture there, he was involved in the estallido social that we were talking a couple of weeks ago. He was terrible about dealing with COVID. He became an extremely unpopular figure. And precisely because of that, the electoral opportunity structure becomes much open for the rise of a right politician. And the second argument that it's important to consider here, this is Bustikova's point of view, that once you have progressive politicians that are politicizing on the socio-cultural dimension, you also open up the political opportunity structure because you give more saliency to these kind of things. If the far right is not active in Mexico, this is one of our negative case studies, remember again, it's because the left, it's not progressive. And because the left is not politicizing that dimension, there is no much space for actors that are going to say, well, but look at the bad ones that are doing these things. Interestingly enough, in Mexico, there has been also some advancement in a better incorporation of historical and marginalized groups, but this is not because of the left, this is because of the Supreme Court. So I think one of the aspects that we need to consider more, and we try to say that in the book, but it's not in the conclusions that you have read, it's a role of the judiciary on some of those countries in pushing the boundaries, but once you have the judiciary doing for that, you don't have a clear agent that is political that is doing that sort of dimension. Colombia, it's also very similar, in which you have a Supreme Court that is pushing the boundaries for abortion, for example, gay rights, but the party is being relatively silent on that. And that also explains. Chile is a counterexample. Boric, president of the current country, is someone who presents himself as a feminist, who has a very progressive agenda, and you have a crisis of the mainstream right. This opens up the electoral opportunity structure for the rise of the far right. So, running out of time, let me move now to some cross-national and cross-regional comparisons. One of the main ideas behind our book project is try to focus on the supply side. So which are the ideas that far-right actors and parties within Latin America are developing? So, and in very simple terms, we try to identify different dimensions that at a theoretical level you might expect that far-right actors might try to politicize. For example, being against immigration, against climate change, being very conservative on the moral dimension, have very strong neoliberal positions, defending penal punitivism, mano dura policies, as I was talking before, advancing populist ideas, and also having a radical rejection of the left, particularly developing this sort of anti-communist or anti-Chavista jargon. And then we look at these different case studies, and the conclusion we try to map which are the similarities and differences between all these cases. One of the first findings that we identify is that all the cases of the far right that we consider in our book share at least two ideas. And this is moral conservatism, so being really, really against abortion and gay rights, for example. And secondly, very strong iron fist policies against crime. And this is why we say that if you think about the far right in the Latin American context, the lowest common denominator that all these politicians have are these two dimensions, so to say. There is a second ideological layer that we find in almost all the cases, the only exception being Bukele, and all the far-right politicians, with the exception of Bukele, tend to be very neoliberal, which is something different than the European context. I will come back to this. And they are very radical about rejecting the left. They have this old reflex from the 70s that you had in Latin America, arguing that the left is equivalent to communism, it's equivalent to dictatorship, and they put within that sort of bracket everyone. So academic like myself or Kul will be there, but also if you're a communist, also if you're a social democrat, doesn't matter. But they tend to use this label. So in this sense, and to final this part about these ideological differences, Bukele, of all the cases that we consider, is the most peculiar one, because in ideological terms, it's very narrow, or it's a very lean ideological project, and in fact, he has only three issues that we can identify: moral conservatism, populism, and penal punitivism. Interestingly enough, Bukele, his own trajectory comes from the left, and then he started to shift to the right relatively later on. And then you have other ideological projects, as in the case of Bolsonaro in Brazil and Cas in Chile. They are much more dense in ideological terms because you have a combination of a lot of different ideological points of view that are part and parcel of these programmatic proposals. So let me conclude then with thinking now more broadly and trying to figure out which are the similarities between these far-right actors that I have been talking in Latin America and try to compare them with the European context. So the first similarity that I think it's important to consider is, despite important ideological differences between the Latin American and the European context, it seems to be that in each of these regions, you can find a sort of lowest common denominator. In the case of Latin America, remember the table that I just presented, these are two issues that are crucial for all far-right actors, and this is punitivism and moral conservatism. And in the European context, we know that the usual ideological cocktail of mix, it's authoritarianism, nativism, and populism. This is the classic concept of the populist radical right of Casmude. So, and this is why, again, I prefer to talk about the far right once you try doing these bolder comparisons, because the populist radical right might be present in some Latin American countries, but not in others. Second aspect that I think it's important to consider is that the far right, both in Europe and Latin America, what they normally do is develop a very nostalgic rhetoric. Let's make America great again. When was America great? When black people didn't have the right to vote, when women were at home. When was Europe great? When there were not many immigrants here. When was Latin America great? When gay people didn't exist. When women didn't have the right to sit in this table and being professors of universities. So they have this nostalgic understanding about the past. In the case of Latin America, it's very focused on women and the military. I think in the case of Europe, it's focused on other dimensions, but this is a common trend that you can see across Europe, Latin America, and the US as well. Last but not least, the book that we have here is not about the demand side. So I don't have data to try to demonstrate which are the reasons of why people support the far right, but we have supply side data. And the supply side data that we have, which is based on which are the ideas that the far-right politicians are developing, it's very clear that culture It's much more relevant in the rhetoric than economics. Or this is why we tend to talk that the politics of recognition are much more relevant than the politics of redistribution. If you buy that argument, that I think it's also true for the European context, I think this has very important consequences for how we think about democracy. Historically, comparative politics scholars thought that one of the main reasons why democracies might be unstable is because of the competition between the poor and the rich. This is very clear in the rational choice theory that will argue if you have too many poor people, the democratic system is not going to survive. If you look at the classic work of Adam Przeworski, which is much more sophisticated, we say that's the main driver of conflict. But if you look at Latin America today, Latin America is highly unequal on socioeconomic terms, and democracies tend to survive. But I think the issue that is at stake nowadays in Latin America is not so much inequality, although continues to be highly unequal, but this is cultural dimension, which is the same for the European context. And again, if this argument is true, I think this is a big message, I would say, for how we think about the evolution of democratic systems and their survival. Finally, which are now the differences between the far right in Europe and the Latin American context? And here are a couple of issues that I need, or I think that are important to emphasize. In the Latin American context, when you talk about the populist radical right or the far right, you normally think about xenophobia. Interestingly enough, this is not the case in the Latin American context. Look at any speech of Javier Milei or Bolsonaro, and they will probably not talk about immigrants. Probably if you have a whiskey with them, they're not very happy with immigrants. But this is not the issue that they are telling you. They're telling about women, they're telling about other issues. Chile is probably the only exception, and this might have to do with the fact that we have an influx of immigrants in the last 5 to 10 years experience, and this is why xenophobia is present in the Chilean example. Second aspect that I think is different in Latin America than in Europe is the connection with the military. Bolsonaro comes from the military. Jose Antonio Cast doesn't come from the military, but if you hear the kind of arguments that he develops and how he thinks about the previous authoritarian government, you see like very clear connections. And Javier Milei, in fact, the vice president, comes in fact from that sort of background. And this kind of connection, again, it's not present in the European context. And in the Latin American context, we know that once the military is involved, this is not good news for the democratic system. Third aspect that is important to consider is neoliberalism. This is one crucial aspect in the Latin American context, but emphasized today. If you think about the far right in the 80s in Europe, most of these leaders were pretty neoliberal. And the far right started to understand that if they move towards welfare chauvinist positions, they might be able to open the amount of people that vote for them. And let's see whether this is a story that might happen in Latin America as well. Bolsonaro, at the end of his government, although he was pretty neoliberal, he realized that conditional cash transfer programs might boost his popularity, and he started to develop an expansive fiscal policy, and he forgot about neoliberalism. So again, whether they're really committed to that or not is an open question that we will see. By the way, Bukele, which is most of the most successful cases, it's anything but a neoliberal. That might be probably a sort of learning process. It's an open question that we might see in Latin America. Finally, and I close with that, some differences within Latin America. Ideological and organizational origins are pretty diverse, as I mentioned before. The level of electoral success and maturity is also pretty different. That was part of our case selection. And finally, the political styles of these leaders are very diverse as well. When we think about the far right, we usually assume there should be someone like Trump or Bolsonaro, who are very peculiar. But look at Marine Le Pen, who has a completely different style. And we have in the far right in Latin America also these differences. Jose Antonio Cast is very well behaved, very polished, very calm, completely different like someone like Milei or Bolsonaro. So if I have one more minute, I close with a very last slide, try to wrap up, so which are the main ideas behind this project, and also of the book that we are hoping to submit as soon as possible to the press. So the first aspect that I want to emphasize again is that the far right in Latin America is gaining traction very fast, and the most obvious explanation is not very useful. We don't see empirical evidence again about a backlash at the mass level. Just to give you another example into that, for the case of Chile, we have a very good survey data that you ask the same people over time, so it's not like one shot and one shot, so it's longitudinal. And we identify, for example, that those who are voting for the far right, these are people that have been always conservative, but started to become much more conservative than before. But if you look at the median voter in Chile, it's not getting more conservative. It's only that conservatives are getting more conservative, and these are the ones that are mobilizing the far right. This is data that unfortunately we only have for Chile, but reinforces his argument that we don't see a backlash argument at the bus level, which again, I think it travels very well to other contexts, thinking also about the European one. The second aspect, I think this is one of the bold ideas that we try to put forward in this book project, is that to understand why is it that the far right is winning traction across of Latin America, but probably beyond the world, and that might sound a bit paradoxical, it's because of the very success of democracy. Once democratic regimes are able to move the democratic horizon and are able to better incorporate people, then you might experience a backlash. I'm an immigrant in Europe, and I think being an immigrant in Europe 40 years ago was completely different than today. Because what is considered politically correct today in Europe, it's completely different than 40 years ago. And this is because democracies have been adapting to immigrants. Democracies have been adapting to women. And precisely because of the success of the democratic system, because of this better incorporation of these historically marginally groups, then you have the possibility of the backlash. But still, I think the black box is, why is it, or under which circumstances, that sort of backlash arguments resonates with big chunks of the population? And one crucial idea that I think it's important to consider that makes the Latin American context different than the European one is, remember, in Latin America, we have presidential systems and with second-round elections. Once you have a second-round elections, what's happened very often is people end up voting for the lesser evil. Why is it that so many people voted for Javier Milei in the second round? Because you had two options. You either vote for a far-right politician, or you vote for a Peronist who is in charge of the economy in a country in which inflation is 100%. What the hell are you going to vote? Many people voted for Milei, but not because of his far-right agenda, but because he was the lesser evil in comparison to the other, and reinforces again the argument of the backlash that I was trying to say. Finally, and I close with that, my main concern, and this is related to some of the previous work that I have been doing for Europe, but also for Latin America, is not only the far right, but it's also the mainstream right. If the mainstream right starts copying the ideas of the far right, then we are in deep troubles. Because to remember the way in which I started this presentation, in which I thought that we can make a distinction between the far right and the mainstream right, and the literature of comparative politics argues that mainstream right parties are crucial for the survival of democratic systems, because then you have agents that are willing to politicize right-wing ideas, but within the boundaries of liberal democracies. But if mainstream right parties disappear, or end up transforming into Assad's version of the populist radical right, think about the US case study, then we are in deep troubles. I think that that problem for Latin America, it's dramatic. Javier Milei made his whole campaign fighting against the Peronists and against Macri. Then for the second round, when the Peronists passed and Macri was out, Macri had a meeting with Milei, and in less than 12 hours, he announced that he's going to support him. The mainstream right disappeared on that day. It took 12 hours. I think in Europe, we still have in many countries, mainstream right parties are in a difficult position, but in many places, not in all, think about France, for example, they're still trying to mobilize a faction of the electorate that is not far right. And I think I have reached my time, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. You showed that I had not promised too much. And I think your research is extremely relevant for many of us, and you have presented it in depth and in a very clear way. So we have two discussants, Manuela Caiani and Cesar Guzman, both from the Scuola Normale. I give the floor to Manuela first.
Thank you, Donatella, and thank you, Cristóbal, for this very fascinating and rich and dense presentation. So it is not easy to comment Cristóbal Rovira Kaltwasser, who is one of the main experts of populism and far right in Latin America, and not only. And most of his works and theoretical reflections, I could quote many, but this is not necessary, have been really the basis for much empirical research on the far right and on populism also in European countries. So it's, I think that this edited volume on the far right in Latin America, which you are going to send to Cambridge, if I'm not mistaken, is likely to be another milestone for the scholarship and for research on the far right and the populist right as well. The book and the presentation overall has many merits. Just to briefly point out two, which I really, and I align on that with Donatella, I think your work it will be also very fitting and useful for the research and the research project that we are conducting here. This book is a very comprehensive analytical framework for comparative research on the far right, which at the same time takes into account let me say, classical explanation on the supply side, but also the specific dimensions, specific country dimensions and contingent and processual and dynamic factors for explanation. So I think that this combination is quite, it's very original. It's not very common to find scholars that try to combine institutional factor plus contextual changes and developments, in this case in Latin America, that have facilitated the rise of the far right. And then, of course, it goes without saying the second strong merit, which is the incredible richness of data that you are going to deliver concerning 8 countries on which it is true there is not yet so much research for what concerns the radical right, the far right. So my comments will be 4, and I hope very brief, because I want to give the floor to Cesar, who is the very expert on Latin America. One is about far-right parties and far-right movement. The second is about the concept of movement parties and how this concept could enrich, in case this very rich already analytical framework of explanation, and then third, diffusion, transnationalization of far-right ideas, and fourth, travel of your analytical framework and comparability beyond the Latin America context. So to start with the first, you are explaining convincingly the rise of the far-right political party side, political parties and leaders. So my first question is, what about the possibility to expand the conceptualization of the phenomenon, also including no-political party actors? And why this, of course, it is under our eyes, is that far-right parties, and also their electoral success, is situated in a milieu made of networks of political movement, cultural, reactionary actors, and so on and so forth. They exchange resources, symbolic materials like frames, expertise, also personnel. No? There is this exchange. So clearly, in terms of empirical term, it is not easy also to add this ingredient. But I think that it could enrich this analytical framework. Also to think about the political parties and their electoral success as an outcome situated within a broader organizational milieu of far-right actors, including anti-gender. Also because, for 2 reasons, in one point you say correctly, scholars focusing on the mobilization rather than electoral strategies in Latin America of emerging right-wing actors have developed a similar conceptual framework than you. So, I mean, there is already some material to work on. And also, I have been very much struck by your main finding. No? When you say that all the chapters and the empirical evidences of this book point out that mainly cultural dimensions are mobilized. And it is exactly on this politics of recognition, more than on the politics of distribution, that far-right movement, or at least non-party actors, are strong. So I think that this would be really promising. I would like to know your ideas and also possible implementation, because, of course, this is the pain. And then, second point, and connected, movement parties. We know the literature on the concept of movement party refers both to an hybrid new actor, and you referred to hybrid actor before, but also to processes of institutionalization of far-right movement on the one hand, but also movementistization on the other hand. And finally, the idea of movement party also can refer to several types of relationships that can be between these leaders and parties and the social movement part. No? And I was very interested by your figure number 2, in which you present all these trajectories, organizational trajectories. And this figure reminded me a lot about the possible analytical types of relationship between far-right movement and far-right parties. And so I was wondering if you can also elaborate a bit more on your book and future project on the questions that, for instance, Sidney Taror put forward in his recent book, 2021, Movement and Parties, to explain similar, not dissimilar topic on the US. How do social movements intersect with the agendas of mainstream political parties on the far right, when they are integrated with parties, and are they co-opted, and so on and so forth. So third point, diffusion, transnationalization, you already touched upon this point. This is a point that I'm strongly convinced about. Very often in the literature of political parties and party success, but also on social movements until recently, and the mobilization, our conceptual boundaries have been the nation state. But while the literature on progressive social movements worked a lot, already developed important theories about transnationalization and diffusion, which are two different concepts, there are no theories on diffusions of frames, ideas across far-right actors in different regions. And here I would like to ask you, is there space to broaden up even more this transnational advocacy coalition factor in this sense? And also, would it be possible to also include in this idea of diffusion, not only diffusion, as you say, discursive diffusions, but also organizational diffusion, practices, so not only the ideational component. And then finally, and then I stop, and thank you for, again, this presentation and this work. On the one hand, the comparative perspective, would it be possible to think about this analytical framework also beyond Europe? I'm thinking now at some Asian countries, Japan, for instance, now is seeing the slow rising, the re-emergence or consolidation of far-right actors, but also Middle East. And finally, about this point on the no backlash evidence at the mass level. My only remark or criticism, are we really sure that surveys are able enough to grasp these opinions at the mass level, but mostly, are there opinions, the element on which we have to focus on? So probably something at the misorganizational level is going on. And I also was very interested by your reference to extreme reactions, not the book of Butiskova. Clearly here we have something concerning gender and also women going on. So I'm thinking, for instance, and then I stop, about the literature which is stressing concepts like modern sexism in order to explain the far right. So a conceptualization of this backlash which is not yet probably grasped empirically by surveys. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela. Cesar, please.
All right. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. This is a really very timely research project. It's comprehensive of the region. There are so many different aspects that would deserve discussion, further discussion here. I understand that this is a collective project, so, I mean, in a way, what I'm going to say is a little bit unfair because it's how I would have addressed some of the issues that you are putting forward here, no? But nevertheless, might be some comments that you might find useful or not. One of the main claims of your presentation and of the book is that, that we are witnessing here a new phenomenon, no? So I wonder, is it that new? Or what is new here? No? I think that one point that you actually you address, you mentioned at least in the 2 chapters and in the presentation, is the idea that some of these parties or leaders have roots in military dictatorships. No, but in my impression, I believe that factor or that component should be stressed further. I think that we can understand at least, we could think of the contemporary far right in Latin America, and we could think of the dictatorships of the 70s and 80s in Latin America as a critical juncture for the contemporary far right. Either because some of these new actors embrace in a nostalgic way, the ideas and accomplishments or so-called accomplishments of these governments, either because other leaders take distance from that legacy, and others take an ambiguous stance between, oh, look, human rights, yes, but look at the economy, which might be the case of, for example, Chile or to a certain extent Peru. No? The dictatorships, as a critical juncture, and then derived from that, the successors of dictators. Who were the actors, and what's the relationship of continuity or breakdown between the actors that you are analyzing here in the book and military dictatorships. In the Chilean case, for example, you can see a line of continuity. Probably in the Peruvian case might be more problematic to trace that line, a straight line. But there are components, there are elements of continuity. Again, the Chilean case, you can see, the UDI party, well, one can say, okay, because there is a far-right party now, UDI is now a mainstream right-wing party. But throughout the 90s, UDI was a complex party in terms of having kind of different souls, Here I'm connecting with the idea of, transitology, this concept of, the idea that there are, within dictatorships, there are pro-negotiation factions that say, okay, we need to negotiate and enable a transition to democracy, and we need to adapt to democracy, versus other factions that were more hardliners, that were against any kind of transition. You can see the same process also in the Spanish transition to democracy, So you have the successors, which represent, again, the same 2 souls, You can see a similar process, again, in Spain, Chile, to a certain extent also in Brazil, and in Central America, of course, So that's one thing, Dictatorships, successors parties, or movements. Then the component that you find, I find pretty interesting and very persuasive, the argumentation towards, arguing that the key factors here is culture, and it's not politics or ideology necessarily. Redistribution or distributive politics. And you find that in most cases, except for one, anti-communism it's a common threat, It's a common characteristics, Which relates, to the Cuban Revolution and to the past, So I'm trying to think here in terms of long-term trends, no? I think that the Cuban Revolution here was, again, like dictatorships, was a key factor in triggering reaction, no? In triggering reactionary politics, no? So I would consider these two components, no? Reaction to the Cuban revolutions and guerrilla movements and dictatorships, no? A couple of other points that I would like to raise here. I didn't find a mention to the role of evangelical churches in your work, which I believe it might have a relevance, especially in countries such as Brazil, probably also in Central America, Peru, a little less in Chile probably, but not completely out of focus anyway. Which also it's related to another point which I would like to raise, which is about also mentioned by Manuela before, the far right as a social or countercultural movement. No, again trying to see the continuities between the past and the present. No, I think that that it would be important to consider further. The idea that given the legacies of dictatorships and given the anti-communist ideology, which can be even traced back to the Russian Revolution, I mean, we're talking about a timeline of 100 years, not a century. Given those components, I believe that we can also consider the far right. I mean, before the success of these parties now that you are analyzing here, where were these trends contained before the emergence of these parties? No. So here an example could be again Chile, UDI. No, as long as this, as long as UDI represented well some of the core values of José Antonio Caz and its current party, no. Things were fine, no? But the same could be argued for example, for the Popular Party in Spain, no? But when things change, when conditions change, then splinter groups find opportunities to become political entrepreneurs, no? So I think that this is something also to be considered. Where were these trends, socio-cultural, political trends, contained before the emergence of these new political parties, no? And to conclude, I find also interesting going back to the idea that there is no backlash at the mass or at the grassroots or citizens level, but rather a radicalization of traditional conservative voters, no? How do you reconcile this finding with findings that have also been discussed recently on account of the Argentinian case in particular? I'm thinking here on the book of Pablo Semán and collaborators, no, for the Argentinian case. Está entre nosotros, no, it's within us, no, it's among us, in which he traced back the popular politicization of the radical right ideas in the popular classes in Argentina, no. So there is also, I mean, there is a process of popular politicization here at play. At least, I mean, the evidence from the Argentinian case suggests that there is such a thing, and that it's not only a radicalization at the elite level, no, which is another of the kind of conventional ideas that come out, both to interpret the emergence and the success of the far right, but also to interpret all the relative or associated phenomena, such as, for example, the rise in mass social unrest in several countries. No, I would leave it. I would conclude here, but I congratulate you and your team for this timely and super interesting work.
Thank you, Cesar. Before opening the floor, I think that you have enough questions to address, maybe in a first round of responses.
Excellent. Many thanks, Manuela and Cesar. This is the best way to present, because imagine this has been already submitted. I would say these are very good ideas. I take note, but it's over. But I still have time
So
to.
it's more
to
dangerous to a certain extent.
No, I don't think it's dangerous. It's time to reflect on certain things and re-emphasize and clarify certain things. So again, in this sense, and others are related to ongoing projects are related to that as well. So some issues might go here and as well. So I will start with Manuela and the different comments that you made. The distinction between far-right parties and far-right movements, I completely agree. I think if you really want to have a very clear picture about the far-right in general terms in Latin America, I think we need to consider the two sides of the coin. And this is not only the parties, but also the movement side of that. So the explanation of why this is not here, I mean, the first one, it's the most obvious and practical one. This is issue of space and time. The second one is, fortunately, we have some scholars that are trying to tap into that. There is this wonderful book by Lee Payne, which is called The Right Against Rights in Latin America, published by Oxford University Press recently, in which she traces, in fact, different kinds of right against rights that it's emerging across of Latin America, and she emphasized I'm not interested in the party dimension, but much on the social movement dimensions. And in fact, I have been exchanging also some ideas with her, and I think there are ways in which we can try to incorporate some of the findings that they have, because they're continuing with that project and the findings that we have. But precisely because we think that so far nobody, or let's put it in that way, I think we have a couple of very good studies on the far right in Latin America, but they're focused on country cases. We have extremely good, the book of Seman in Argentina, it's great. We have very good books about Bolsonaro, but what we don't have, and this is what we are trying to do here, it's like to cover this diversity. And by doing that, I don't want to claim that it's irrelevant to look at the far right movement link, so to say, but I think this is not the place to do it. And again, I think there are scholars that are doing, and I hope that in future iteration of that sort of project, we can try to combine that. And I will come back to this because I think the diffusion dimension, then the movement parties is extremely relevant and might be even more relevant than the parties per se. And I think that the movements have like a certain background of diffusion that runs in a different way or in a combination with the parties one. And, and finally about that, I also think that there is a sort of division of labor between leaders and movements. So the leaders try to do certain things, and they also can rely on the movement aspects because they know that they're going to the other side, so to say. In this sense, there is an interaction, and this is why I think you're absolutely right. If you really want to understand the phenomenon, you need to look at the two of them. About the far-right movement concepts, I would say, I will have to look. I have seen the work of Taro in 2021. I was at Cornell last year and I presented that and we discussed that. Probably I have to look again. I think that probably for some cases might work better than for others. Bolsonaro is the prime example. And in fact, there is some literature, in fact, that it's talking that, what the hell is Bolsonaro? It's a leader. I mean, he has changed his party. And in fact, many Brazilians nowadays talk about Bolsonarismo. And in fact, Bolsonarismo, it's a sort of movement, if you want, so to say, that it's supporting, not him anyway, because he cannot compete in elections for the next 10 years. He has been banned, but Bolsonarismo is already there. And Bolsonarismo is able to mobilize either him or people claiming in the name of Bolsonaro, so to say. So I think in the case of Brazil, Marisa von Bülow, for example, has been done some research into that. I think that probably the far-right movement concept, movement parties might work very well, but I'm not sure if that might work for other cases. So probably then we'll need to consider for which cases or not. But your point about figure 2, it's good because probably one of the things that we have to better specify is where the social movement component might play a role or not. So to say it's something that we can try to bring in. Diffusion, absolutely right. I think this is crucial. One of the problems of diffusion is it's extremely hard to analyze it empirically. As you can imagine, I'm vetoed by all these leaders. If I knock the doors, they will Google what I'm doing. Open Society Foundation is funding me. I'm the devil. They will not open the doors. So probably one of my PhD students might have a better option. One of them is trying to do this research, but it's very difficult to do. But there are ways in which we can try to tap into that. And I think it's important. And I think the aspect that you emphasize is important, that it's not only the ideas, although they are crucial. I think there is an issue of organization. And I also think in terms of electoral campaigning, there is also a sort of diffusion process. CPAC, it's very important in the United States, a conservative caucus that they have, and they're very crucial. My impression, what you read and people that are doing field work, it's not only diffusion of organization and ideas, it's also about practical strategies about how you run campaigns, how you do surveys, how you compete in elections, etc. But I think there is a diffusion going on. Finally, about the comparability and the other comments that you made, I completely agree with you, and one of the arguments of why I'm so keen on stressing the concept of the far right, I think that the far right, and this comes through Andrea Pirro, who has been developing that argument, but Cas Moody as well, is that the far right as a concept, it's big enough, so to say, to incorporate these differences. India and Indira Modi will look very similar, in fact, to the Latin American cases. If we stick to the populist radical right, I think we narrow the level of abstraction in sartorial terms, and probably this might travel with a bit more problems, and this is why I prefer the far right. Finally, surveys. I think that surveys are useful, but. So there are two ways in which you can read surveys. One way is surveys are right and we are wrong. So the people are not getting more conservative and we need to find the puzzle elsewhere. And I think that this is to a certain extent true. Because if you look at the survey data, as you're showing in Latin America, but also in Europe, I mean, you don't see like big differences in the long term. But if you read carefully surveys, but also what actors, different scholars are saying, is that the position of the people might change over time, but because of the elites. The whole literature on polarization in the United States show you that polarization started at the elite level. And once you have so big polarization at the elite level, that has an effect at the mass level. I think this is also slowly happening in Latin America. In some countries, people say, oh, there is a lot of polarization. I would say there is not much polarization at the mass level, particularly if you look at public opinion data. But at the elite level, there is a lot of, look at Twitter, they're fighting against each other. But once you have that 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years, then it has a spillover effect. If you look at the book of Larry Valters for Europe, that's the argument that he's doing. And this is why he calls democracy erodes from the top. Once the elite engage in that sort of language, that it's very problematic for democracy, although the surveys is showing us that today there is no problem, it might be that in the long term you might see a switch, so to say. And I think that in this sense, I would say we can use surveys, but we need to be careful with how we use surveys. And finally, we also need to be a bit more innovative in how we measure certain things. Just to give you an example, one of the issues that we are doing with our funding, it's run a couple of surveys in Latin America, and we are using an index of anti-feminism, which is, it's very unpolite. We ask questions like, all feminists are bad. Women always want to get things from men. And what we find out, in fact, is there are not so many people in Latin America that are anti-feminist. But if you want to explain, vote for Milei in Argentina, the best predictors of all the indicators that we have, it's anti-feminism. The highly correlation that we have, the highest, it's not the economy, it's anti-feminism, although it's a small fraction of the population. And in this sense, I think if we can try to incorporate new measures to try to better understand certain issues, I think probably surveys are useful, but we need to be careful. I go now to Cesar, also very good comments, and I took a lot of notes. I will try to address some of these issues. One of the aspects that you emphasize is what is really new about this far right. And I think the first one that I emphasize here is this issue of entering the political arena. In the 60s and 70s, many of these far right projects, most of them were very apolitical, anti-political, in fact, and this was the common argument of O'Donnell about authoritarian parties and authoritarian regimes at that time. And I think nowadays we have two issues that makes these forces different. I mean, not only the entering the political arena, but two other issues that are important. In most of these cases, as you see here, we find out that many of these leaders are very populist. And I think this is a novelty. I think classical far-right politicians in Latin America, they didn't care. They will not talk the language that the people is right and the elite is bad. But Bolsonaro is doing that. And this is a novelty. If you look about far-right projects in Brazil in the past, they will never claim that they were talking in the name of the people and against the elites. So you have there something new, so to say, not in all the cases, but in many of them. And the second aspect, and this is to a certain extent related to diffusion, is that they use another kind of jargon. One of the best examples here is the concept of cultural Marxism. This is an invention that comes from Europe. And you see Jose Antonio Cast, imagine for a second Jaime Guzman that you know will wake up, so who is the leader of the UDI, one of the founders, and he hears Jose Antonio Cast talking about cultural Marxism, and he look at them and say, what the hell are you talking about? Where did you get that? Probably I went to CPAC, I met some friends, and apparently this is a useful framework that works for bringing that Marx is at bad, but not because of the economy, because of gender ideology, whatever. And then you see like new sort of narratives that we didn't see in the past necessarily, although they might have been very conservative, but the way in which they frame it, I think is different. The issue of authoritarianism, I completely buy the argument. This is particularly in the southern corner, Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, very clear that you have this connection between the current far right and a very peculiar relationship with the authoritarian system. And the example that you will give at the UDI, I think it's a good one. The UDI is a conservative party that we consider normally a mainstream right party nowadays. But if you look at that party at the beginning of the 90s, the literature tells you that there was an authoritarian successor party that was not democratic. In fact, it was probably a far-right party. And the party took probably 10 years to moderate so that it transformed itself into a mainstream right party, mainly because of Joaquín Lavín and Sebastián Piñera. And precisely because of this moderation process, you have José Antonio Cast, who has been always a backbencher within the party. And to be honest, it's true. He's saying, this is not the party that I believe in because the party has changed, not myself. The problem, and this is what José Antonio Cast doesn't get, is that Chilean society has changed. If you look at public opinion data, again, Chile at the beginning of the 90s was the most conservative country within Latin America. If you look at public opinion data today, it's one of the most liberal countries. So what the mainstream part, what the UDI made is transform into a mainstream right party because the party understood that this is the only way in which it can govern. Similar story to the PP in Spain, Alianza Popular, deeply authoritarian. It took several years until it moderated. Aznar was the key figure. But here comes the other part of the story why I ended talking about the mainstream right. I think that part of the problem is the far right. But my main fear, it could be the case that José Antonio Cast disappears in 5 years. It could be the case that Milei disappears. But these mainstream right parties are going to exist. The question is which kind of ideologies are going to defend. My fear is UDI, and you're already seeing that, might transform into a far-right party as it was at the beginning of the 1990s. And this is one way in which the far-right has an impact that goes beyond the electoral arena, but it's an impact in the party system as a whole. About the evangelicals, good point. I think we don't emphasize that much here, mainly because we are looking at the supply side. If you look at demand-side data and with the surveys that we have been doing, I was just talking to Donatella with that. For example, we ran surveys in Argentina, Chile, and Brazil last year. And when you try to understand that the far-right voter and the social demographics, it's very different across the countries. The Milei voter is very young, but the vote of Bolsonaro and Cast is not very young. If you look at the Bolsonaro voter, it's highly correlated with education and income. So the richer you are and the more educated you are, the more you will vote for Bolsonaro, but this is not happening in Chile. But if there is one commonality about supporting the far-right in these three countries, it's being evangelical. If you are evangelical, the likelihood that you will support the far right, it's 10 points higher. So it's one of the main drivers, and this is related to the ideological package, so to say, of the far right. But then, of course, you have differences between countries, because Brazil, the evangelical community is huge, Argentina is relatively small, and Chile, it's in the middle, 10 to 15% of the population, but I think it's part of the story that probably we need to consider. Finally, I close with the issue of the backlash. Maybe I'm trying to be here too provocative with the issue of there is no backlash. I think, is there a backlash? I will say no and yes. There is no backlash in the sense that at the aggregate level, if you look everyone within the society, you don't see a major shift that the whole of the society is getting more conservative. But if you dig into the data more carefully, you will realize that there is a backlash. In the sense that I was talking to you with this longitudinal data, people that were conservative in the past are getting much more conservative. So there is a faction of the electorate that is driving this backlash, which is not necessarily the majority. Again, if I look at my polling data that we have done in Argentina just before the first round, if you try to understand support for Milei, which was 30% of the vote, the cultural explanation is the one that drives the support for Milei, which is anti-feminism. It's the best indicator. The people that voted for Milei in the second round, it's different. They voted because of the lesser evil, then because of the economics. Is there a backlash in Argentina? I would say no, because the majority of population is still in favor of progressive values. Nevertheless, the people that are conservative are getting much more conservative. And these are the core supporters, so to say, of Milei, which is roughly 20–30% of the population. And this is why we need to be careful with that. Finally, on that, I think those who are interested in this backlash debate, I think the best piece here is the critique of Armin Scheffer to Engelhardt and Norris. I don't know if you're familiar with the classic book of Engelhardt and Norris, in which they talk about the backlash. The argument that they made, it's very simple and wrong. What they say is societies are getting more liberal because we have new generations that are much more educated, and these youngsters are the ones that are driving the progressive values, this classic modernization theory. And in fact, Engelhardt and Norris and many others are saying, don't worry, because youngsters, the older generations are dying, and the youngsters are the ones who are going to live up. And this is why this is just a short period of time. And in fact, they try to provide evidence about that. If you look at the last piece by Armin Scheffer in the British Journal of Political Science, he shows empirically that all the calculations they have done are wrong, are completely wrong. They miscalculated. And in fact, there is no empirical evidence that youngers are getting more progressive. In certain issues, yes, in others not. There are big differences across countries. And this is why I think that the far right came to stay. If it would be only a generational issue, why should we care? But I think it's much more than a generational issue. And I think this is why the backlash debate, I think it's relevant. We need to better disentangle who are driving the backlash, so to say, how stable can be this backlash, and to what extent this might grow over time or not.
Thank you very much. I open the floor. I see Lorenzo Bosi, and then
thanks a lot. Very interesting, and looks very promising, this work. I think you framed, at least at the beginning, like this difference between the Latin American case and the European, and this quickness that you were referring to was like somehow like open like some light in my head, and I think I was thinking along the lines of Cesar, like that maybe like the continuities with the historical past of Latin America and the dictatorship is something that should be like taken into account in order also like to balance this quickness that you don't understand that if you don't refer to like the past. And I think in these continuities, something that I would usually like try to avoid, but I think here is part of that history is the role of the US, and how the US have changed their geopolitical interest, or their geopolitical like ways of impacting like Latin America, and to see like whether like their criticism or their impossibility of entering in Latin America with a dictatorship had also an impact on far-right politics in Latin America, and if that is, helping you and helping like to understand this shift in electoral politics, because that would be like really interesting, I think, and somehow speaks along the lines of diffusion, but more than the diffusion, what you were like, I think, referring, that is resources. If on the back of the far right, you have certain type of resources that are economic, but are also like cultural and political in terms of programs that come from the US, then that is, something that helps you like to understand, I think, this shift and this increase on the far right in the Latin America.
Yes, thank you. I have a lot of comments that I can send you by email, but I'll just ask a quick question. I have some objections regarding the demand and supply side. The supply is to voters and voters alone. And in my research on clientelism, in the case of Greece, there are two markets. One is for voters and the other is for key sponsors. Because without key sponsors, you won't be able to appeal to voters. And that may explain why in some cases you have the radical right and not the radical left, for instance, because all the conditions that you mentioned as the ground, the fertile ground for discontent and dissatisfaction could have been capitalized by the radical left. And the radical left has very limited success in Europe, only when it's attached to unions and some social movements. In Latin America, much more so because of clientelist connections and a lot of corruption as well, once they get established in places like Argentina with left-wing Peronism, because there has been a right-wing version of it, and Venezuela. So who are the sponsors, the key sponsors? They mentioned the church, but are there any business actors who are parts of the elite that a few years ago supported authoritarian regimes and military dictatorships in reaction to what they feared the outcome would have been if more left-wing politics are in place? And can we simply see this phenomenon as a new form of authoritarianism and can be linked with hybrid regimes and electoral authoritarianism, which in the end is, instead of tanks, we can use populism to serve the interest of certain groups that are fearful of democracy itself?
Can I add a couple of questions? Very interesting, in fact. I have questions about the conceptualizations, because you take Norberto Bobbio just to distinguish between the left and the right. Then you mentioned that there are different dimensions of inequalities, and one can be defined as social, economic, and the other socio-cultural or civic things. But you don't use it, at least at the conceptualization level, to distinguish type of far-right movements. While when you present then the summarizing table, it seems that this element could be relevant. So, for instance, in Italy, you have Fratelli d'Italia, who is both very neoliberal in the policies and hyper-conservative in the type of arguments, but probably at the policy level even more. I was wondering if it would not be useful, maybe thinking from the perspective of Europe, but also how it applies, to distinguish something like Alternative für Deutschland with the lesbian leader and other instead more coherently. Then second element I was thinking about is why conservatism, when it doesn't seem to be the winning strategies automatically at the electoral level, because there are not so many electors going towards, so the backlash, a critique of the backlash arguments. And I was wondering there if there is some types of organizational explanations. For instance, in the case of Fratelli d'Italia, Meloni is probably also with a type of lifestyle indifferent to this type of values, but they got a lot of support from the anti-gender groups. That then they had to sort of reciprocate by locating these people. So it is not because of the electorates, but it could be because of the need to build some type of militant groups that, as you said, in the past was typical of the mass parties, but then they also needed, and the evangelical church, for instance, is quite established. And another question I had is about Ken Roberts and You already look in some parts of the explanations to the other side. So they win also because the left, the pink wave, is losing. Ken also went more into distinctions within countries in Latin America with reference to the ways in which they had addressed the neoliberal critical junctures. So the case of Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador were cases in which the existing left-wing political parties collapsed because they didn't resist neoliberalism and so on. I wonder if there could be some type of explanations in these directions. You don't have some of these countries there, but how much the politics on the other side, since it is very much, as you say, anti-establishment, fueled also by the presidential logic, how this plays a role. And the final question I had is about sort of Polanyian and mixed with Rocanian view. In Latin America, you use a lot the term of incorporations and disincorporations. The pink wave was a wave of reincorporations of those social groups that had been excluded by military coup and so on. How much there is this sort of Polanyian way, which, however, seems contexted because while the pink wave was more homogeneous, yet it seems that you are looking at a revival of the far right, which is, as you also said, heterogeneous. In some cases, it's not that it goes away, but it is resisted, like in Brazil. And so, is this how much? Maybe it is a question also related with the class dimensions of it. So how much there is an organizations of those who want to disincorporate these social classes. And how much this is connected also, if we think about Rocanian cleavages, not only to the class cleavages, but maybe also to the reopening of center-periphery and especially church-state cleavages. So this type of return of arguments of neoconservatism that are also quite embedded in the church versus secularism, that maybe are also a way to hide the socioeconomic dimensions. Because what I remember from the Italian case is when Giorgia Meloni won the elections, the main fear was on the sociocultural dimensions. But the real harsh politics were more the socioeconomic one. So it was what was not mentioned because it would have been not popular, but was driving the process.
Excellent. Many thanks for the comments and suggestions. Regarding the first point that Lorenzo made, and this is about the role of the military dictatorship, that's probably one of the common threads that we might find, at least in the Southern Corn. I think that the way in which I read that, maybe it's very much influenced by the work of one scholar whose name is Kurt Weiland. He has a very wonderful book published by Cambridge University Press a couple of years ago, which is on the diffusion of authoritarianism in Latin America in the 70s. And the question that he asked himself is, how is it that these authoritarian regimes were able to become available across very different Latin American countries? And he develops an argument that I think it's pretty interesting and convincing. And what he argues is that the main problem is at that period of time, the elites, mainly right-wing elites, business communities and right-wing political parties, acted in a very irrational way, or if you want, thinking in terms of bounded rationality. The argument that they made, it's like Cuba happened, and this is going to replicate all over the region. And in fact, you have the Che Guevara coming, and then they say, if we don't do something, they're going to kill us. This is why we're going to do whatever we need to do to support authoritarianism. If you think from rational terms, it's completely stupid. In fact, Che Guevara came to Bolivia, he died. I mean, and you had like a Marxist movement in Chile that was trying to do something, but they didn't have enough guns to do something that is going to subvert the democratic system. But they were so irrational, and in fact, what Kurt Weiland made is look at a lot of memoirs, interviews, etc. As he say, this irrationality drive their fear to support anti-communism. And I think that what you are seeing nowadays in Latin America within the far right, and this is why of the common topics that we find, this is issue of anti-communism, anti-Chavismo, to a certain extent is the same reflex. But I think that also part of the story is Venezuela, because this did happen at least in one country. And Venezuela nowadays, it's clear an authoritarian regime. It was considered as the role model of democracy within the Latin American countries because during the 60s, 70s, and 80s didn't suffer from authoritarian regime. Then Chavez came in, Chavismo, blah, blah, blah. We know the whole story. Nevertheless, I think the argument of Weiland applies wonderfully. The chances that Chavismo might be successful in elections in Chile, in Argentina, etc., it's very low. But this reflex is very active. And this is what these supporters are driving. And I think it's something that it's important to consider. And again, I think the argument that Weiland developed for the 70s, I think plays very well for many Latin American countries today. The argument about the United States, I think it's crucial. And the way in which I understand that, if you look at the classic work of Levitsky and Way, which is about competitive authoritarianism, they say why competitive authoritarian regimes are most successful in some places and others not. This has to do with what they call leverage and linkage. Those countries that have a lot of linkage with the Western world, and at the same time, the Western world has a lot of leverage on them, the possibilities that a competitive authoritarian regime will succeed, it's very low. This argument works when you have progressives in power. Once you have Trump in power, linkage and leverage works exactly in the opposite way. Once you have Trump there, for Bukele, it's great. Let's continue violating human rights. This is the same that the United States is going to do. And in this sense, I think that the Trump phenomena for the Latin American cases is much more relevant than Meloni and the far right in Europe. And in this sense, the issue of the shifting of the mainstream right in the United States into a far right, I think it's dramatic, the impact that this is having across of Latin America, I would say. The demand side and supply argument, I think that, again, we were talking before about the business community, and I will argue here that the argument of Weiland plays very well. I think what happens with the business community is acting in many places in a very irrational way. Just to give you another example, Steve Levitsky, who probably you know because of his famous book on how democracy died, he told me that he went to Brazil just days before the election of Bolsonaro. He had a meeting with the business community, close meeting with 200 people from the Jewish community, telling them, Bolsonaro, it's going to be a nightmare for democracy. And these 200 people in the room were yelling at him, telling that the PT, it's going to destroy democracy. And he was telling them, look at economic indicators in Brazil during the government of the PT. This is a moment in which the whole business community profit. It's completely irrational to think that the PT, which is a social democratic party, is going to destroy the economy. But these 200 people in the room were convinced that the PT, it's the devil, which is the reflex that I'm telling about Kurt Weiland. And in this moment, all of them supported Bolsonaro, who is a nightmare. And in fact, in economic terms, some of them profited, but not all of them. But I think here shows again that this business community, some of them might work in a rational way, and some of them might work very irrational. But I think it's probably another of the agents that we need to consider across of these far-right countries. And this is why I think that in most of these countries, you also see that neoliberalism plays a big role. And this is in part because they're being to bring in this business community, which most of them are in favor, of course, of this kind of neoliberal policies. About hybrid regimes, I would say that the sad story is at least we have one case in which the far right has been able to get reelected. This is El Salvador, and El Salvador is not a democracy anymore. Bolsonaro was not reelected, but he tried to conquer the system in an undemocratic way. So my feeling is that if the far right in Latin America is able to secure power more than one time, democracy is going to collapse. At least we have one case study that is showing that, and I think if in Brazil Bolsonaro would have been able to win, I think we'll not have a democracy in Brazil nowadays anymore. A couple of small things now about what Donatella was saying about the role of different militant groups within this organization, I think it's relevant. But again, we need to consider differences between these cases, because once you have electoral vehicles that are so dependent on the leader, then of course these militant groups have less influence. But once you have party organizations that are a bit more structured, then you have a real problem. Because what happens then, and this is a bit the story of France, then if the party tries to moderate, with that I'm not saying that Marine Le Pen is completely moderate, but she has followed the strategy of de-diabolization, then you will have a competitor within the far right saying, I'm going to develop the right policy, so to say. In the case of Chile, for example, you're seeing that because Jose Antonio Caz, although he's a far right politician, he's very moderate, and then you have certain militant groups that are pushing the party into another direction. And probably it's important to look at these interactions, I would say. About the Ken Roberts argument, it's fun, I never thought about that, but probably if you try to apply Ken Roberts to that sort of argument that I'm putting here, the crucial question would be, I think, I'm just talking out of the blue, it's not what was the role of the left during the neoliberal reforms, what has been the role of the left in terms of progressive reforms in cultural dimensions.
And also what has been the role of the center-right?
As well, of course. So it's the interaction between them. And again, for example, Mexico, which I think is a fascinating case study, the story of why there is no far right there is because no party is politicizing that dimension. Because probably they know that this is a battle that it gets very, very complicated. We'll see what happens with Claudia Sheinbaum, because she's a woman, she's a bit more progressive. If she starts politicizing that dimension, my feeling is the party will lose the next election, because it will not able to get the 50%, but it depends how to do it and also how the other parties do it. But I think I will think more thoroughly about that, and the juncture for me would be not the socio-economic dimension, but rather socio-cultural reforms then, I would say. Finally, on the class dimension, I think we need more data and better data. So to have surveys that are equivalent across countries, we are producing some of the survey data, and as mentioned briefly before, it's very difficult to identify common patterns across of Latin American voters for the far right. I think I would be very skeptical, at least in social demographic terms, to talk about the far right voter in Latin America. The evangelical dimension is the only one that you find. But if you look at social class, even the urban-rural divide in Argentina, of course, if you're in Buenos Aires, you don't vote Milei and the opposite. But in Brazil, it's the opposite. The stronghold of Bolsonaro is Rio de Janeiro, which is one of the most progressive cities. I mean, Sao Paulo, it's very pro-Bolsonaro. So in this sense, I think we need to be careful about these kind of generalizations, and we need better data. And I hope to have funding to continue with that kind of research. Thanks.
And we hope to invite you next year to have some follow-up results. Thank you, Cristóbal, very, very much. And thank you, Manuela and Cesar. And thank you to the public. In 1 week time, Sofia Donoso will present still on Latin America, but more on the movement side, on the progressive developments. Thank you.